Hello, and welcome to Disability Connection. I'm your host, Laura Best. I'm an intake specialist at Disability Law Center. The Disability Connection is produced by Disability Law Center. The DLC is the protection and advocacy agency for Massachusetts. We're part of a national network of disability rights agencies who investigate systemic abuse and neglect in congregate living facilities. We also provide legal representation and other advocacy services to people with disabilities. DLC's website is www.dlc-ma.org. Welcome to the first episode of our mini-series, The Life of a Self-Advocate. Today, I'm joined by Caitlin Walsh, DLC's administrative assistant. They're going to discuss their experiences with disability, finding community, and reasonable accommodations. Hi, Caitlin. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your job?
Sure, Laura. Thanks for having me. I have been the admin assistant at DLC for 4 years already, and I mainly work behind the scenes with a lot of different folks. I help out with intake, I coordinate outreaches and make sure everyone has the proper swag. I'm posting on social media, doing a lot of different things. I identify as a peer, and that is someone with lived mental health experience. And I also have a chronic physical illness.
The swag is one of the most important pieces of outreach. So that work is greatly appreciated. But tell me a bit more about your experience being diagnosed with disabilities.
Sure, I was a kid when I was diagnosed with Crohn's. I was 11. And then I was 17 when I was diagnosed with a mental health condition.
And what was that experience like?
So I was really embarrassed to talk about having Crohn's as a kid. I remember starting school and I needed to give the nurse's office a doctor's note to allow me unrestricted bathroom access at school.
Oh,
And yeah, and then the protocol was I would take a copy of the note, introduce myself to each of my teachers. I was already in middle school and show them the note. Um,
God.
yeah, yeah. We had to request to go to the bathroom during class and use hall passes. So it's September. I'm starting at a new school. There's a teacher who's also brand new, hasn't been at the school before, and this was over 2 decades ago. I still remember that teacher giving me a hard time. They didn't fully understand the doctor's note. They didn't fully understand my issue. They didn't know what was going on, that I actually needed a accommodation. So that was fun.
Or not fun, let's be real.
Yeah.
I would imagine that would be hard, as a child, you're still finding yourself and figuring out who you are. And a big part of that is finding a friend group. Was it hard to find a community when you were a kid?
Yes. I was already pretty, I felt like isolated in some ways. And getting this diagnosis at 11, it was like, great, I'm even more different.
Yeah.
I didn't, because I couldn't really feel comfortable talking about it, I didn't know anyone else who had Crohn's or colitis besides my mom. So it was pretty isolating. And I remember as a kid on the internet finding online communities, and this was before social media. I craved connection with other folks who had chronic illnesses, folks who understand what it's like to juggle so many appointments and meds,
Yeah.
having to refill a pill box every week, that kind of thing. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's yeah, that's so difficult. And it's a testament to who you are that you found community. And I think it's a universal experience that the online people find more community online. Has that changed now that you're older and social media definitely plays more of a role now?
yeah, I like to think it has changed, based on growing up as a kid with a chronic well, not one chronic illness, but two chronic illnesses. I try to be as quote unquote out as possible. Like, I know I live with invisible disabilities, and I know when I am in remission, I don't look sick, as people say. I know I pass as able-bodied. So, now looking back, I feel like, oh, I had a lot of self-stigma. And like I gate kept myself, or it's like,
Yeah,
did I even count as a member of the disability community?
real. That is such a real feeling. Um, Speaking of the disability community, how would you define the disability community?
That's hard because one thing I've learned is the disability community is really diverse. I tell people we're not a monolith. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but if you look at a disability pride flag, there's multiple stripes going through a gray background, and each stripe stands for a different community or a different disability. So there's a stripe for physical disabilities, for sensory disabilities, for psychiatric disabilities, and then invisible disabilities. And then there's a stripe representing neurodiversity. So looking at the flag, um, I can see myself in the psychiatric disability stripe and the invisible disabilities stripe. Um, Another thing that like shows how diverse the community is, one person's access needs or like an accommodation of using a screen reader to navigate the web wouldn't work for everyone. It's way more of
Right.
an individual experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's such a good point. For me, what's so special about the disability community is that we created it ourselves using unique experiences and experiences that the general public or society in general kind of considers hush hush, not things that we need to talk about. Keep that in your personal life. Um, what are some ways now that you're an adult and you're a self advocate and you're working at DLC, how have you created that community for yourself?
Yeah, that's another reason why I try to be so out and forward and, you know, about this. Um, so last year, I had a chance to participate in the Real Talk at Boston project, hosted by MIT. And I got to recruit and interview groups of people with disabilities, and I asked them what it was like to live in the city. So there were folks with both visible and invisible disabilities and chronic illnesses. And a lot of the issues that came up were like navigating the city as a person with a disability, accessing healthcare, or finding accessible and affordable housing. And those issues really resonated with me. It wasn't just something that I saw coming through the work at DLC, it was something that I knew my community already struggled with and I could really resonate with. And some of the folks were employed and struggling to get proper accommodations. So it was something that I was really happy I was able to participate in. And I felt like we had really good conversations, bringing, the disabled community to the table for this project.
And I think it's important to point out that you have a unique stake because you're born and raised here. And I think walking into, a real talk community where it's people who are living in city of Boston, you were born here, you were raised here. That's not my experience. You walked in and people probably were like, Charlestown, I get it. Like this is exactly what we need right now to talk about this.
To-
I
yeah, totally. It was a bit of a struggle for me to remain in the role of the interviewer once the tea came up because I am a huge transit nerd and because I've lived in Boston all my life, I know the system really well. I
yeah.
know that there's been real progress made, but it is not a perfect system. And so I think I bonded with the folks because it was like, oh yeah, me too. And I'm trying to like feed them questions and keep the conversation going, but I'm like same, everything, just same. So yeah, it was a great experience.
Yeah, it like being a fan, but also being the interviewer. I love that though. I want to circle back though to accommodations. You mentioned meeting them during school and you shared that really personal story. I think a lot of people with disabilities have similar stories. Have you needed accommodations moving into adulthood and into the workplace?
No, I actually haven't had a formal accommodation in place since school. At my previous job, also kind of admin role at a nonprofit, it was a part-time position. So I didn't have to worry about, navigating my chronic illnesses and scheduling all the appointments, because I could just focus on, when I was not working. And now that I'm in a full-time position, we're in COVID and I have a flexible hybrid schedule. So I'm very grateful. It's easy for me to just say, hey, I have an appointment. I'll come
Yeah.
into the office this day instead of that day, or I will work from home because it's virtual.
Hmm.
And to be honest, because I haven't had a formal accommodation at work, I would not have known what the process was if I didn't work at DLC.
That's so right. The reasonable accommodation process is not something that the average person understands. I certainly didn't know anything about a reasonable accommodation. The phrase wasn't even within my mindset or vernacular until I worked at DLC. Um, but if you could pick one aspect about accommodations, the wide swath of questions you could ask about accommodations. But if you could pick one aspect that you wish more people knew about or was talked about more in the community, what would you pick?
I think in order to get a formal accommodation recognized and documented for your file, I don't think that people realize there is an interactive process.
Yeah,
So it's not a given that what you request will be granted as is.
correct.
First of all, your employer can request documentation like a provider letter, a doctor, a therapist as medical support for the accommodation. And then they may suggest a different accommodation that would be just as effective to help you perform the essential functions of your job. And depending on where you work, sometimes there's a clear process. You put in your requests, supply documentation, and then work with your employer to get the accommodation in place. But then sometimes your employer either doesn't have a clearly defined process. Maybe they're unfamiliar, no employee has requested anything on file before,
Hmm.
or, unfortunately, sometimes employers push back and
Yeah.
deny the request.
Yeah.
So, looking at it from a formal, I need this on the books, process, it looks daunting.
People talk about the personal as professional, and I think, the reasonable accommodations is a great example of that. Um, and the word you used, daunting, I think is the right one. Um, and also invalidating, you know, understanding yourself to need a specific kind of accommodation and your employer coming back and saying, well, we actually think this one would be better. That's a very invalidating experience for someone because of course, how would they know exactly what I need? Um, I I'm curious though if accommodations came up at Real Talk or um, how accommodations come up in your own community.
Oh yeah, definitely. The folks who were working in some capacity, and I interviewed them as part of Real Talk, highlighted that they had major issues in disclosing and major issues getting accommodations in place.
Yeah.
Some folks were literally fearing for their jobs because they had tried to request accommodations and encountered
Oh
pushback.
no. Yeah,
Unfortunately, that is a very real thing.
it is. It
So,
is.
but I'm also part of a peer mental health support group, and I've been part of that community for 4 years as well. And I know we have a group of young adults, and some of my friends have brought up employment and their trouble requesting reasonable accommodations. Um, the one that I can think of off the top of my head is trouble requesting time off for therapy appointments during the day. A lot of
Yeah,
therapist providers have business hours that conflict with working hours. There's really no way around it.
absolutely.
So, knowing what I know from working at DLC, I've tried to help by sharing the self advocacy info we have on accommodations on our, DLC website that you can find under the info for consumers section, which is www.dlc-ma.org/info for consumers. And then one of the websites that I know about through the intake and referral process that I see, getting offered for folks with employment issues is the Job Accommodation Network website. And that's kind of like a hub of list of conditions and possible accommodations. If you're not even sure what would help in your job, it's a great place to start looking because they offer suggestions to ask for. And then Jan's website is www.askjan.org.
Thank you for plugging the info for consumers webpage. I'll also add there is a specific document on there on the interactive process, which we talked about earlier, that I know a lot of our consumers have found really helpful. And as an intake specialist who does referrals every day, uh, Jan is a wonderful resource for folks. So I'd encourage everyone to take a look at it, even if you're not in a place where you need accommodations in the workplace. It's just a great place to look for resources. Unfortunately, that is our time for today, though. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us. This show will be available on our website and as a podcast. Please follow us on our social medias, which are always posted on our website, www.dlc-ma.org. That's www.dlc, like Disability Law Center, -ma.org for the links.
Thanks, Laura. Happy to chat with you as always.
Amazing. Thanks, Caitlin.